I think it's a really interesting week this week because, of course, it's going to be the start of a new month. So on Friday, we have the latest US non-farm payrolls, so the US unemployment numbers. These are clearly being closely watched month on month at the moment because we have to try and get an idea of what the economy looks like as various economies around the world come out of lockdown. But there's a lot happening before that. But I thought, well, let's start off looking at a US market. And we've got the NASDAQ 100 here, so that the tech-biased US stock market index. And I think it's been interesting. The last sort of month, really, during September, we've seen a lot more volatility on the NASDAQ than we had been used to. We'd had this great recovery off the March lows. The NASDAQ 100 had been setting fresh all-time highs since June, so breaking through the previous high in February. It pushed out again to an all-time high beginning of September. Let's just zoom it in. But it's sold off quite heavily since then. So it traded up to almost 12,500. And then by the third week of September, had lost almost 2,000 points. So we've seen a lot more stock market volatility in September than we used to. But at the start of the month, or start of the day, we are seeing this strength coming in. This is the latest move on the NASDAQ in pre-market trading. So I think stock markets are a really interesting one to watch this week. We have those payrolls on Friday, but do we see further recovery for these markets? So I think it's going to be a really interesting one. S&P 500, of course, similar sort of moves on the S&P. Where again, all-time highs early September, sold off, and then some strength. So I think watch stock markets for signs of further recovery. Before those payrolls on Friday, we do have lots of data coming out on Wednesday. So Wednesday morning, we've got German unemployment and retail sales. So that will be interesting to see how, clearly the most important economy in continental Europe is doing. And we also have UK's GDP number. So how is the UK economy doing? That comes out on Wednesday morning. And we're already seeing this week, if we take a look at the pound against the US dollar, if I zoom over, this is the move so far today. So the pound ended last week at around 127.40 against the US dollar. It's up about 150, 160 points just in the first half day of trading this week. So I think that's going to be a really interesting market to watch all this week as well, particularly because we have the GDP number coming out on Wednesday. We'd seen this great recovery from the pound off the March lows. Those March lows were the lowest the pound against the dollar had been since 1985. So we've seen a massive recovery, but then a really big sell-off during September, going from 135 down to 127. So an 800-point slide for the pound. And I'm just wondering, the strength we're seeing now, is this the start of a bigger recovery for the pound? Also on Wednesday is a really big day. We've got Eurozone inflation data. So that comes out 10 a.m. in the morning UK time. So if we take a look at the euro against the US dollar, again, of course, we've seen a euro recovery since March against the dollar. Back then, a euro was worth about 107, or a euro bought $107. It did push as high as 120 in early September, but sold off quite a bit since then. We are seeing again at the start of the week, we're seeing a bit of a recovery for the euro, not quite as impressive as the pound. But given we've got so much European data and US data coming out this week, I think we can definitely expect volatility. Plus again on Wednesday, so on Wednesday we've got UK GDP, Eurozone inflation. In the afternoon we have US GDP. So again, going to be closely watched to see what the US economy looks like. So I thought, well, let's take a look at the US dollar index. So again, this is technically another currency market, but it's the US dollar against a basket of currencies, the euro, the pound, the yen, the Canadian dollar, etc. So it gives us a much smoother idea of what's happening with the US dollar. And since March, we've seen the US dollar rally really strongly in March when investors were looking for a safe haven for cash, given the volatility we were seeing in markets. But since then, the US dollar has really weakened. The US dollar index had dropped by 10% into September off those March highs. But the story for September, if we zoom in, you can see we're seeing a recovery here for the dollar index. So it's had quite the run. It's gone from what 91.70 to 94.70. So we've seen a 300-point rise, about 2.5% rise for the dollar into September. So I think this is going to be another interesting market to watch, considering all the news we have this week. Perhaps in the short term, the recovery's gone a little bit too far. So we could see a bit of dollar weakness this week, helping the likes of the euro and the pound. But I think into the end of the year, it's a really interesting market to watch the US dollar to see if we see more of a comeback. On the subject of the dollar against other markets, I thought we'd have a very quick look at silver. This was, I think it still remains a really popular market, massively volatile this year. So we've gone from about $12 an ounce for silver in March, and then traded up to almost $30 in August. A massive move in the price of silver. But since then, we've seen the price hit quite hard. And I think what's played its part here is that US dollar strength. We've seen US dollar strength in September. A stronger US dollar normally pushes down the price of gold and silver. And I think it's interesting here to see how silver reacts this week, particularly if we get perhaps worse than expected GDP data out of the States, if the US economy looks a bit weaker than we were expecting, and if we have maybe worse than expected unemployment numbers on Friday, perhaps we'll see something of a recovery in the price of silver as investors look for safer assets, places again to store their cash. But I think it's an interesting market, silver, and it will be worth keeping an eye on to see if this $20 to $22 area ends up being something of a floor. I think the last market to look at is crude oil. So crude oil clearly reacts with what's going on in the wider economy. On Wednesday, we have the usual crude oil inventories out in the afternoon. That's basically how much stock of crude oil is there out there stored up. Crude oil has been fairly boring over the last few months. We did have something of a sell-off in early September, down to $36 a barrel for US crude oil. I think if we get weaker than expected economic numbers this week, the price of crude could be under some pressure, but it doesn't really look that exciting at the moment. So for me, I think the market to watch this week probably are the various foreign exchange markets. Do we see the US dollar build on more of a recovery from here? But I think this week is all very much focused on what happens on Friday. We have those non-farm payrolls out, those US unemployment numbers. So expect plenty of volatility on Friday, but lots to keep an eye on as the week goes on.